So good morning, everyone, and welcome to DIIS, to what I'm sure will be another interesting day of all things Ukrainian. As some of you will know, we had two events yesterday relating to Ukraine. We'll have another two events today, and I'm very excited to be able to welcome you all here for those two events. My name is Flemming Splidsboel, and I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS, and it's my pleasure to host and to moderate the two sessions that we have today. We'll start off with a session on lessons learned and prospects for the war in Ukraine, and it's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker, James Nixey from Chatham House. It's your first time here, so special welcome, and I'd like to appreciate or extend my appreciation for your time. You're very generous with your time because you're only here for this event, actually, so we're very pleased with this. And as part of this, let me also acknowledge the cooperation that we have with the British Embassy. It's been very generous in supporting this event and in bringing James over, so thank you for this. So what we'll do for this first panel is that James will give us an introduction to the war as he sees it, lessons learned and prospects for the war. And James will speak for an approximate 45 minutes or so. Then we'll go into the Q&A session. And what we have just agreed is that Andrew Wilson, who's with us also from University College London, will be joining James for the Q&A session. So we'll have a panel, a very British panel, which is great. So there's a special treat in that for you. So we'll do a Q&A session for about 45 minutes. After that, we'll have a short break, enough for you to get some fresh air and a bit of food before we turn to the second panel, which will be looking at the wider security developments in and around Ukraine. And I'll introduce that panel later on, but let me just say that we will be involving and engaging some of our colleagues from Ukraine, particularly from the Ukrainian National Defense University, so welcome to you also. But that will be after the break. So with that, I suggest to start, and James, please.
Please. No? Yes. Right. I knew that would happen. Give me 1 second, ladies and gentlemen. But let me just say, it is a real pleasure to be here with you guys this morning, and I am honoured, and I feel a little bit unworthy with the substantial expertise in the room, not just because I'm in awe of Andrew Wilson, which is true, as one of a few real Ukraine experts, as opposed to the make-believe ones we sometimes get, but with the Ukrainians in the room and the considerable expertise that we know here at DIIS. So, I suppose I do sort of self-identify as a Russia expert, but at the same time, as I was saying to a few friends last night, it's a bit hard these days because we're in a very unusual position of not being able to get into a country that we're meant to be expert in. That's not really true of anywhere else, except maybe North Korea, maybe Iran. Not quite so much though, and that just goes to show how far we've come, or I suppose how far Russia has come, I'm afraid, or gone. But my institute was declared undesirable in February of 2022, and it was a long time coming. We'd always been thought of as the most hawkish of the think tanks in and around Europe, I suppose. I would argue that was justified, even back then. I mean, Putin started badly back in 2000. I mean, people seem to date these things to 2008 or I don't know, maybe Litvinenko in 2006. But the reality is that they started cutting down freedoms as early as the end of 2000. So anyway, I do think that not having access to the country does make us all the poorer for it. Unless, of course, you're the most ardent Putin Versteher, in which case you can still get in and out, but that does discredit you somewhat. So, I will do exactly as Flemming ordered me to do, which is talk about the lessons learned and a little bit about the state of play today. But there's some irony here. Well, let me just start by saying, I suppose it's inevitable if you're talking about lessons learned, there's going to be some considerable degree of critique here, so be prepared. Because I think, as I was hinting at before, it's because we didn't learn the lessons of the early 2000s, but yes, especially 2008, the Russo-Georgia War, and 2014, the first war against Ukraine. It's because of that we are where we are now. Now, I understand, of course, that you cannot ever entirely prove a negative or an alternative history. But I think it's a pretty decent alternative proposition that had we responded more robustly back then, in particular with much stronger sanctions. You know, if you say we're at Force 9 sanctions now, Force 2 sanctions back then, but had we done it back then and kept on increasing the pressure, I think that it's a reasonable proposition that we wouldn't be where we are now, and that the Russians may have calculated that a full-scale invasion of Ukraine would result in harsher penalties still, and would not have gone through with it. That said, I have to concede, well, Vladimir Putin is an obsessive, he's a fundamentalist, and of course such people do not relinquish their ambitions easily when they are so single-minded, ruthlessly minded. And possibly not at all. So I may be wrong about that. I think we have to accept that point, but it would have happened anyway, no matter what. But we do know for sure, of course, that our countermeasures prior to a full-scale invasion, attempts to bring him around to our way of thinking, to inveigle Russia into our ways, that trade, interdependence would help. We do know that had absolutely no effect whatsoever. And I think it is worth asking, since we have a little time, it is worth asking why we didn't do that back then. And there are so many reasons, and I've just jotted down a couple. But the truth is that I'm afraid that the most our primary interest in Russia in the 90s and the early 2000s was in making money there. The profit margins were fatter than they were in other parts of Europe, and so we did not wish to spoil the trading relationship. And we saw that not long after the first invasion, when somebody was photographed entering Downing Street with something saying, we shouldn't endanger the relationship. It'll spoil trade and/or international relations with Europe, with Russia. Sorry. So I think that was deeply problematic and always has been. And connected to that, I mean, the reality is there were influential people in the corporate sector successfully lobbying government not to go too hard on Russia. We know this for sure now, sometimes known as lords on boards as well. Another reason, a third reason, if you like, is that there seems to be some sort of, and I do apologise to my friends and colleagues in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, some of whom are here today. But the truth is that there is it's in diplomats' DNA to want to find a negotiated solution, even when there can't necessarily be one. And so it's the whole jaw being better than war kind of thing, even when jaw is going nowhere. It's admirable. But I'm afraid there has to be, sometimes they need to look at it and understand a little bit more, as perhaps their counterparts in the MOD do a little bit more. This is true for all defense ministers and foreign ministries, that this sort of second track diplomacy, 1.5 diplomacy, simply isn't going away and is actually having a negative effect overall. Another reason why we didn't do what we did is fear of retaliation. I haven't been keeping time, by the way. The fear of retaliation, and that still exists today, of course. That certainly the BBC would get thrown out of Russia, or or BP would in some respects. And so I think that was definitely holding us back. And finally, and most importantly for me, is the degree of Russocentrism, whereby all roads go through Moscow. And this is true for my own education incidentally. And that's why I do praise Andrew so much as being somebody who's Ukrainian studies expert, lifelong, as opposed to becoming one through Russia. And I have to admit that's me, by the way, which I don't consider myself a Ukraine expert. But but the Russocentrism, educationally, corporate-wise, and diplomatically, I think is to blame for our inability to be a little bit more honest with Russia, or a lot more honest with Russia, prior to February 2022. Or if you really want to say, maybe you can trace it back in the case of the UK to pre-Skripal, if you like, in spite of the fact that Litvinenko was almost 10 years before that, more than 10 years before that, actually. So those reasons for not doing it are still probably sound familiar to you, because in a sense, because we're still holding back so much. Now, of course, the scale and the awfulness of the full-scale invasion has cured some people of those delusions, and it's cured some people of some of the delusions, and it's cured some people of all of the delusions. But not so much, I'm afraid, that some are not alive and kicking in the minds of policymakers, and not just policymakers today. Certainly it's true for the corporate sector still. I know so many have left, but so many are hedging their bets still. And the truth is that it's very difficult to get somebody to understand something if their salary depends on him not understanding it, if you see what I'm saying. The point is that we are still being held back, which is holding Ukraine back. And we're obviously in a David and Goliath situation, except that David doesn't really have a properly operating sling, and he has a rock shortage. So, and that is where we find ourselves. And the other truth is, of course, that no Western army would ever be asked to attack positions without a good 2 months, really, of softening up the enemy from the air to start with. And the Ukrainians have paid for that absence of air cover, if you like, with their lives, with thousands of lives, quite frankly. And that's to say nothing of the wrangling we've seen over, say, cluster munitions, the use of, or obviously attacking, hitting targets inside Russian territory, both of which have finally been resolved, but after how long? I'll say resolved, more or less resolved, partially resolved anyway. But beyond that, and bringing it back to the political, if I may, it is still astonishing to me how few Western politicians are prepared to say that Ukraine must be victorious, that it must achieve an unambiguous strategic victory, and that Russia, must be comprehensively defeated. They do seem terribly nervous about it. Not so true, of course, in Eastern Europe. Naturally, but I'm afraid in Western Europe we do have trouble saying the very simple, and I suppose for one reason for that. I've been thinking about why that is. Excuse me. I suppose one reason is because we don't like to lose, and we've lost so many times before. We've even lost to Russia. We lost to Russia in Syria, right? But Vietnam, Iraq, those were all losses. And we don't commemorate our loss. We commemorate victory days, of course, in the West. We don't commemorate loss days. So, but I think more than that even, then the West doesn't actually accept that it's at war. It doesn't like to, even though Russia is absolutely on record as saying that it is at war with the West, in almost as many words as that, then there's a big problem. If Russia thinks it's at war with you, then you are at war with Russia, whether you like it or not. And obviously that would have certain consequences in terms of mobilizing society, as Russia has done, towards war, certain sacrifices that politicians to be elected don't like to have to do. And so that is why we don't do it. But it's also, I must say that it's also, with all due respect to the Ukrainians in the room, because Russia is at war with the West and because European security is at stake, I don't fully accept the premise that victory should be defined solely by the Ukrainians. I do obviously accept the premise that nothing should be nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. That seems to be a sine qua non. But I don't fully accept the idea that only Ukraine is responsible for defining victory. I think that is in the West's purview as well as Ukraine's, if that is okay. I hope that doesn't sound too offensive to my Ukrainian friends and colleagues. So I thought, on a related note, and I should maybe say a little bit about what it takes to deal with Putin's challenge to the West, and what the hurdles are ahead before I come into prospects for the war, etc. So I think what it takes to, I mean, for what it's worth, I think there's about 10 boxes that I mean, I haven't actually got a list of 10, but I mean, I think there's a number of boxes that have to be ticked for Ukraine to prevail, Ukraine to be victorious, Russia to be defeated in this war, and we've got to tick, kind of 8 or 9 of a 10 in order to achieve this. But first of all, I mean, obviously enlightenment comes with an understanding that we can't go on like this. That Russia must not be allowed to continue to prod, poke, push, maim, kill, invade with impunity. Because right now it's just acceptance. People say it's like in Russia there used to be a phrase "Это Россия." That's Russia. It's what it does. It was a great deal of. We said things were unacceptable, and then we simply accepted them without any consequence, any pushback whatsoever. And I do think there's a great deal of acceptance still happening. So if you take, for example, I don't know, after the Kharkovka Dam, it's about a year ago, right? I mean, there was no response other than expressions of grave concern, of course, that to that ecocide, if you like. Or I don't know. Take another example. Take Alexander Lukashenko's downing of a flight between Athens and Vilnius. That absolutely one of the most outrageous acts I can remember, but is soon swiftly forgotten without any real substantive, let's be honest, punishment for it. And so very simple. And I know that a lot of people are trying for deterrence by denial as opposed to deterrence by punishment. I was in Estonia all of last week, and that's the way they're shifting. But I can't help but thinking that deterrence by denial, and we can discuss this. You can deter, maybe 9 out of 10 attacks, and then the 10th one will get through. But we don't have much information about what happens if you do deterrence by punishment, because we haven't really tried it that much. Okay. So what else does it take to deal with Putin's challenge to the West? Again, somewhat controversially, there is almost fanatical, maybe fanatical is the wrong word, there's an obsession with remaining unified in the West. I'm kind of bored of it in a way. I mean, it's just because it's in a sense that it's never going to happen. I mean, when you look at the problematic countries inside the EU, inside NATO, we know who they are, but obviously we're talking about Hungary, Slovakia, possibly Turkey in some senses. But then I think we are that ends up us coming down to a lowest common denominator response, which has disastrous consequences out in the field. So I think it's more important, therefore, to have, if it's not a great statement, coalitions of the willing, and for a few countries who are really serious about it, that's both the powerful countries, or where the centre of security gravity lies, and where the centre of moral gravity lies, that's in Eastern Europe, less powerful, but they've gotten it right more often, to be able to get together all the more and not rely fully on, getting full consensus, which, frankly, will never come. On a related note, I think it is important that as many countries as possible do give clear statements to Russia, which has never really been done. And again, we are so much to blame for this. It's never really been done. But we were honest enough with Putin to say that there is no such thing as a sphere of influence. There's no such thing as an historically conditioned sphere of mutually privileged interest, I think was a phrase. And that your plans, ideas, ambitions for the post-Soviet space, will simply not be realized. And I think we were we were quite frankly, we were simply afraid of speaking truth to power, or no, it's not quite the right phrase, but of being honest with Putin about that, and saying that if that Western clubs are available to those who want it and who achieve the requisite, meet the conditions, and that Russia will never, ever, as a third party, get a veto. And that would have been quite useful had we been clearer, because I think it was our ambiguity, and I know there's such a thing as strategic ambiguity, and that can be useful, but only in certain circumstances. But our lack of clarity, I'm afraid, has been with Putin in particular, has been deeply problematic. I did mention that I've already mentioned that we don't say enough what we want, that Ukraine must win at all costs, almost all costs. But I guess my final point on what it takes to deal with Putin's challenge is that we just need more of a sense of urgency. I mean, we seem to have become inured to the war. It has long since left the front pages, by and large, of certainly the newspapers in my country, but I know in a lot of Western European countries I don't look at newspapers in Denmark, if I'm honest, but whereas I promise you that in Eastern Europe it is on the front page every day. It still is. And the public still thinks about it every day in a way in which I know that they don't in my country, for example. So it needs to be a renewed sense of urgency, and then a renewed understanding of the sheer horror of Russia prevailing, and the quite realistic possibility of it, I'm sorry to say, and what the world would look like, what Europe would look like, what the world would look like should that happen. But also equally, you can flip it. On the flip side of it, actually, how much better the world could look, in terms of a model or a model going forward, if Ukraine prevails. Now, okay, hurdles. I mentioned hurdles. There are so many. Obviously, year of elections, the big one in November. There's a little one coming up next month in my country, and that's not actually that relevant. But that is, I think, both presidents are problematic. They're not equally, both presidential candidates, I should say. They're not equally problematic. They're just both problematic. Biden seems to I mean, his number one priority for this war has been not to get involved in it, and that has shown itself in the prolonged elongation of this war. Certainly, when I've been in the US over the last couple of years, then it is the people who are responsible for, say, strategic stability. Then you can tell that the Russian narrative of nuclear of a nuclear strike has seeped into the US consciousness in parts of the Pentagon and the NSC. That has indeed held them back, even if there have been some improvements in the last week. As we can see, it's still bit by bit, as you all know. Added to that, of course, I think was the difficulties of the new war in the Middle East, which has not only taken attention away and resources away, but it has given a little bit more substance to Russia's accusation, bearing in mind the straitjacket in which the Western foreign policy, especially American foreign policy, finds itself in. It's it's given the Russian narrative a little bit. I mean, the Russian narrative rarely has any credence whatsoever. A little bit more credence in its accusations of hypocrisy. I'm deeply worried about, in the next couple of weeks, we have a summit in Washington, a NATO summit, which is likely to look like a victory. I'm worried it'll be self-congratulatory. Look at what we've achieved past 70 plus years. And that when you think about Vilnius last year, and I think the statement was something like, Ukraine will be a member of NATO when the members decide it'll be a member of NATO, or something. Something ridiculously tautological. they're looking for a formulation desperately so that they don't have that quite same embarrassment. But obviously, Ukraine's not going to get what it wants, and it will be and that is going to be something. Look, you'll get over it. Summits come and go, just like elections. Well, summits come and go anyway. But it's going to be we do hand our victories to Putin rather too much. But I have to say, I mean, in America's defense, even in Trump's defense, it's the unwillingness of Europe to be more responsible for its own security is something that we still haven't faced up to, getting to a 2% or 2.5%, even if they are slightly fallacious figures because of what they don't mean, what they don't cover. I mentioned it before, but I do think we lack the imagination to see how much better the world could be if Russia were to suffer a full and crushing defeat. One other thing, that having spent, I suppose I've become a little bit biased and over the past week spending it in Lithuania and Estonia as I have, but it would be good if we were not to see Eastern European countries as Russophobic or biased or prejudiced towards Russia in any way, which I still think we do. And you can see that, by the way, of course, in the top positions held in Europe, which have rarely, if ever, with the possible exception of Donald Tusk, held senior leadership positions in Europe because they are thought of as being, it won't go down well in Moscow. So what? So I do think that I mentioned earlier about the center of moral gravity being in Eastern Europe, and not enough people. I mean, there was an article recently, I can't remember who it was by, but it was "Be More Finnish." I'm sorry, Danes. Be more Baltic. I can't remember exactly the title, but the point was we should be learning from them. Since they're at the pointy end, and have been at the pointy end for a long time, and they are. It is amazing to me, just being in Estonia for what it's worth, that the think tankers and the government representatives and the politicians and the army. There's an extraordinary unity of viewpoint and opinion in a way in which the cacophony. And I know you shouldn't indulge in groupthink, and it's useful to have other points of view. But it sometimes feels too often in my country that we're fighting against ourselves as much as for a real enemy common to us all. You don't get that so much in Eastern Europe, and you probably don't get it so much here, I suspect. But I don't know Denmark very well. And I just again, in terms of hurdles, these are conceptual hurdles. But the other concept, I suppose people still don't understand that Europe is a different geography to that which it used to be. It's just, Europe's boundaries change over time. And yet at the same time, I don't know, I'd be interested to know if it's true here, but I think that people still consider the post-Soviet states, and of course we haven't found a very good name for them. It's an anachronistic region. It's an X-region. It's little visited, little seen, not holidayed in, not known, and so there's a mindset problem. I mean, even Barack Obama, I remember in something like 2000, I don't know the date. I'm sorry, something in 2010, 2012. I remember he gave an interview to the Atlantic and said that these countries will always be in Russia's orbit. Why? I mean, that's just a question of physical proximity, but it has nothing to do with geopolitical persuasion, ambition, and ambition. And that is the ultimate Cold War mindset. We are often called Cold War warriors. It's if I had a penny every time I've been called that, I'd have, I don't know, 74 pence. But but to think like that is the ultimate expression of the Cold War, actually. So, I think understanding that Europe is a different geography, very much including Moldova and Ukraine. But then you can start excluding Georgia from that if you wish to, of course, for obvious reasons. Maybe you can start including Armenia. We shall see. And we can go into this if you wish. And then finally, in terms of the hurdles that lie ahead, and this is maybe the most important one, is the the push for compromise. It goes back to what I was saying about being in the diplomatic DNA. But I simply say to this, which part of Russia's narrative would you compromise with? Which part of Russia's narrative does one accept? I'm always being pushed, even by my own, we call it nachalstvo, leadership, senior management in my institute. I'm always being pushed. Yes, but what if, surely they can give up Crimea? Surely, in spite of the fact that Ukrainians are doing extremely well in Crimea right now, I'm always being looked at. It's always people who in organisations such as which are professional mediating organisations are always looking to do this, partly because they earn money from it themselves. But and it's not so much that I am dogmatically, I am dogmatically in favour of President Zelensky's maximalist position for a solution to the war. It's just that there's a strain of defeatism in the West, as if it can't be done. And that does not, I'm not suggesting it will be done. The analytical part of me says, of course, it's finely balanced and it could go either way, and it's on us. But I think the idea that it can't be done is a little bit a potentially self-fulfilling prophecy. We can go into that. Right, it's enough knocking of Western approaches for now, although doing lessons learned, as I say, is inherently going to do that. But as I say, the fate of Ukraine and of European security is absolutely on us. The Ukrainians are certainly doing their bit, and we are, I think I would describe us as more playing for a draw. And whilst it's obviously true that what we have done since February 2022 has been unprecedented, quite extraordinary, it is equally true that the scale of the challenges means that we need to do so much more. So we shouldn't be patting ourselves on the back so much when we're in such a precarious, finely balanced knife-edge situation. In other words, I guess what I'm saying is that our house is on fire. It's just because it's not our bedroom. It's the Ukrainians' bedroom next door, that we haven't fully realized it. Okay. I don't quite know how I'm doing for time because I forgot to look when I start, but I'll just do a little bit on prospects for war. Okay. So, the obvious truth is that neither side has achieved its goals. Russia has not lopped the head off of the Nazi regime it sees in Kiev. Doesn't really believe that, of course, but it hasn't defanged the Ukrainian military, obviously, and it hasn't ensured that Ukraine will never join Western institutions. And it certainly hasn't taken enough territory in Ukraine to claim a convincing victory. And on the other side, of course, Ukraine has not managed yet to evict Russia from its territory, to say nothing of achieve reparations. Although some interesting updates on the seizure of Russian assets held in Belgium and other places just in the last week, of course. We can go into that. And of course it hasn't achieved judicial satisfaction yet, although I do think the ICC arrest warrant for Putin is a significant step, actually. So I mentioned it was finely balanced, but I'm afraid I also have to say this. Andrew will know this better than me, and to say nothing of the Ukrainians in the room. But it's going to be a rough year ahead. Despite the already being felt effects of congressional aid coming online, it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine, and that's partly because Russia knows it's going to be very difficult for it in 2025, so it's putting all it can into the war in 2024, if that makes any sense. We don't play up the successes we've had. I mentioned Crimea earlier, but obviously in the Black Sea as well. But it is that is obviously to the Ukrainians' immense credit that it has done that with one hand behind its back. But I do think that neither side is invulnerable. Neither side is indefatigable. Both sides look set to keep on going, keep on taking chunks out of each other. The Ukrainian side, as far as I can tell, is digging in well. This war has seen, maybe I'm straying into the next session, and I shouldn't do it because I'm not a military expert. But it's in this defense has been an advantage over attack, if you see what I'm saying. And the Ukrainians will be as hard to dislodge in the next year as the Russians were during the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Both sides have serious economic problems, personnel problems, although Russia has more. In fact, Russia is increasing its personnel supply as it happens right now. Ammo is about the same. Kit is a bit worse. Both sides have internal cohesion problems, of course. Both sides have external support problems. You know, Russia with China, for example, the West, where we talked about our lack of cohesion. So we can talk about that sort of those. Because I'm going back to hurdles again. So, but I would say that full mobilization has not yet occurred in Russia. Actually, I mean, we say its society and economy is mobilized for war, and that is true to a certain extent, or a considerable extent, but not to a full extent. There is more that can be done in Russia, which is worrying. It's an ongoing process there. Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think their personnel is increasing by, having suffered about 150 to 200,000 losses, and they're putting more into it, and so yeah, I guess maybe almost in conclusion, almost, I get, since it was lessons learned. It rather depends how much faith you have in Western politicians to do that. I mean, do you think we learnt the lessons from COVID? Do you think we're well prepared for another pandemic if it comes? Most experts I know in that field would tell me not. I mean, it's a more complex question than we have time for here, but I'm not fully convinced we do learn the lessons of history. Would we go back into business with Putin? No, I guess not. He's probably a little too toxic himself. Doesn't want it anyway, obviously, so it's a hypothetical. But pretty much literally anybody else, it is in our nature to offer olive branches, despite the evidence. We engage much more in policy-based evidence making than evidence-based policy making. That is true throughout the region, probably elsewhere as well. But I just think that somebody who is marginally less toxic, marginally less sociopathic than Vladimir Putin, I can see us marginalizing or becoming Russocentric once more because of what it is. That's the danger down the line, if you like. But somebody will be, and then we would perhaps give away more than we should, and more than we are able to now with somebody as Putin is, if that makes any sense. I mean, it's let's be clear about the dangers of Russia, whereby I don't know, it doesn't, how do I put this? Liberalism and democracy have never been associated with success in Russia. So it's the least likely option. There's a good article in Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy, I get the two mixed up, by Stephen Kotkin, looking at the possible futures of Russia. He looks at 5, and he certainly thinks that the least likely successor state to what we have now is a liberal democratic Russia. The Russian opposition in exile aren't going to be the next president of a one after that of a one after that. That's not how Russia works, and it's not how the system operates. And even then, I can't help thinking that plenty of Russians who we see now, who used to be ostensibly democratic or profess the virtues of democracy, are now pretty rabid. Whether that's something like Dmitry Medvedev, who tries to out Putin, whether it's something like Dmitry Trenin, who was, I think, fooled a lot of the Western. He was our counterpart. Whether you're Chatham House or DIIS, then he was the guy most people look to, but I'm afraid he didn't turn. He was always like that, and he's certainly made his bed. He's made his bed now. So I guess my point is that one shouldn't trust too much in whatever comes next in Russia, and because that's simply not learning the lessons for the lessons. I was just on. You did ask me to say, I think, a little bit Fleming about prospects for negotiations. I mean, well, they're slim, is the point, for reasons mentioned above, neither side being at all ready for it. And I think there's people say that all wars end up at a negotiating table, and I don't think that's right. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, look, Russia is happy to come to the negotiating table and discuss the terms of Ukraine's surrender, of course, and similarly the other side around. But it seems to me that actually most wars have a clear ending. Only in special circumstances like Korea do they not. Look, I mean, there's going to be a peace summit in Switzerland this weekend, and the Russians aren't invited, of course. The Chinese and the Brazilians have made issued a statement which doesn't get around to talking about territorial restoration of territorial integrity. Chinese are staying away. They're phoning around to convince others to stay away. Other countries are sending low-level delegations. We shall see what comes of it. I think Switzerland is likely to be disappointed if it doesn't clear a path towards negotiations. But I think Switzerland is probably not the ideal country to understand that taking a Chamberlainian path won't lead to a Churchillian victory, as they say. I just really I keep coming to conclusions perhaps, but so I need to end. But just to say, I think we really need to ensure that public interest remains high. As I said, once public interest is lost, then the war is lost, and that's difficult after 26 months, after 844 days, I think. I could be wrong about that. I've lost count. You see, that's the problem. I've lost count. I used to count. If we want to prevent war in East Asia, then that is going to require Russia's strategic defeat now. The parameters of a peace now will define the norms of European and global security to come. And if we don't, then it'll have disastrous results of which people have not been which has not been properly impressed upon people. Really, I guess my final point would be to say that, nothing succeeds like success, and that is, and you think about how in the late last year previous year, when there were considerable successes in Kharkiv region and elsewhere, then that buoyed up the Americans. It made people think that they weren't throwing good money after bad. It helped. I mean, the Americans do like a winner, like in the Hollywood movies, and I think that is the fact that is not so evident right now, although it ought to be, is that. Whereas, and at the same time, Russia is launching these unconventional attacks across Europe, multiplying their efforts across the Western world, which we still don't consider to be, which again we just shrug off rather than consider it. So it's not really a conclusion, but I've got so many conclusions. I think I've done about 5 conclusions. Maybe I could leave it here, Fleming, and Slava Ukraini, of course. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So, thank you for this first part. Really powerful. It's like an autopsy of the predicament that we're facing. So thank you very much for this. And let me invite...
That's a dead body, though, of course.
Yeah. Let me invite Andrew to the station. While Andrew's joining us, perhaps I can just ask Samuel to help me rearrange, because then I think we'll bring in chairs for you to sit down.
Great.
Yes. Now you've been standing for 45 minutes, so we'll just pull this over. And then you may start thinking about questions to ask. Har vi de høje? Jeg tror faktisk, det er bordet, det der. Ja. All right, we'll just bring in chairs.
Thank you so much for keeping me company.
Thank you for this. So you may sit over here. So please have a seat.
After you. Cheers.
We have a microphone for you, so when you ask your question, please identify yourself and then ask a question. If you would like to direct your question to either James or Andrew, please do so. Otherwise, we'll just throw it at them and they'll decide in between themselves. So who would like to go first? Yeah, thank you. So have a question at the very back.
Thank you very much. I am Alexei Poltrakov. I'm from the National Defense University of Ukraine, and for a long time I worked in the scientific institute which studies international security. And
I think your microphone isn't on. Sorry. Oh.
And namely,
all right.
Am I clear?
Yeah.
Well, my question is to be like this. We're still missing a kind of framework for analysis of Russia strategy, Russia geostrategy. As far as Gerasimov doctrine is some way overestimated. Actually, it's not a doctrine, it's rather tactical monitor to be thought as a doctrine. My colleagues from the Ukrainian profile institution, National Institute for Strategic Studies and so on, have just proposed an idea to see the Russian strategy, the Russian geostrategy as so-called geostrategy of revenge. The ideas for Russia have lost the Cold War and has a serious intention to replay it in new condition with new approaches, with the new goals and aims. What do you think the optimal framework for analysis for Russia geostrategy to be, and what do you think of the idea of geostrategy of revenge to be a capstone for further analysis? Thank you in advance.
You and me.
Great question. So please.
You start with revenge, and I'll add
Fair
the
enough.
something.
I'm starting with revenge. Okay. Yeah. So I certainly agree with the how you. I agree with the premise of your question. Unsurprisingly, perhaps. It's such an irony, isn't it, that both Russia refuses to believe it lost the Cold War, and at the same time wants revenge for losing the Cold War. But of course, Russia is nothing if not a museum of course. But it's nothing if not a Russia's quite comfortable with contradictions, of course. So that's not a problem. Yeah, it is. I mean, I do think we underestimate the visceral hatred that Vladimir Putin has for the West. Even Medvedev was happy to eat burgers with Obama in a New York diner or something. Putin would never have done that. He is both jealous of it. Again, it's another contradiction. Jealous of the US and hates the US. And I think there must be this underlying sense that Russia can never achieve what the US has achieved, despite the US's, despite America's, many deficiencies. It has come a long way in a relatively short time, and the Russians have wanted a piece of that without ever being able to achieve it. So they haven't, their strategy. I mean, I think maybe something I should have mentioned, definitely should have mentioned, is that the Russian strategy has changed. So whilst initially we were talking about a special military operation to denazify Ukraine, then it has decided that wasn't really working. People weren't really buying into that. So it has instead decided to co-opt as many countries as it can after the initial pushback at the UN Security, at the United Nations, literally on the eve of war, when so many voted to condemn Russia's invasion. That has suffered incremental, not mission creep, but incremental losses. And Russia now has the narrative that it represents and leads the global majority, which is true in possibly true. It's not true in any real sense, but it's potentially true in country terms, and world population. Not true, of course, at all in terms of GDP. It's very clever, I mean, it's super clever to talk about the global majority because it appeals to it appeals to faddish notions of a global South being being on. So I was in South Africa a couple of weeks ago, and they profess not to be pro-Russia. They have very little understanding of Russia or Ukraine. Ukraine is certainly, in particular, again, they think of Ukraine a little bit like Putin does. It's barely a country at all, if I'm honest with you, to the South Africans. But they certainly have no knowledge of it. They're much more interested in talking. And of course, they say, well, it's not. They just want to talk about Sudan. And I understand that, by the way. We do of course ignore some of the other grave wars and conflicts in the world. But they don't. I can understand to an extent because proximity does matter. But Russia's co-opting of the global South and the anti-colonialist narrative, the irony of ironies, again another irony. Russia's war against Ukraine is nothing if not colonial and imperialist, and yet at the same time it's accusing us of that very same thing, which of course is true for the past, but not so much right now. I'll leave it there.
Well, great. I'd be really glad to stop talking about Gerasimov. So I'm glad that you're trying to frame it differently. A geostrategy of revenge implies guilt, yeah? But there isn't any guilt. Who lost the Cold War? The Soviet system lost the Cold War. Who imposed the 1990s on Russia? Russians did. Right? So you have this very strange strategy, not so much of revenge as ressentiment, right? Which is a much richer word in French than it is in English, because it's all about your internal problems rather than as much as your guilt or responsibility, and how you displace that onto others. So it's a war or a geostrategy of ressentiment and displacement, all right? Relabeling all these problems as something else, right? So in terms of learning, one thing that we haven't learned sufficiently is that Russia is a state that uses propaganda, but we don't conceptualize it as a propaganda state. Right? Everything that it says is weighed for its weight and impact in their alternative reality politics, right? Which makes realism redundant, and it makes dialogue impossible, because the Russians are opening their mouths, but they're not talking. Right? They're just emitting propaganda all the time. So you can't really negotiate in those conditions. So revenge is better, but I think going a bit further, without being too philosophical about it, I think would be even better. This is an invented war of all sorts of Russian problems, right, displaced onto the West.
Thank you. Great. We have a question here at the front. Mikkel, please.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Major Michael Storm Jensen, Royal Danish Defence College. A question at the operational yet strategic level. Currently, Russia is burning through armor in a way that seems unsustainable with regards to their current production. Given that we're looking into a war of attrition, how do you see this influence Russian operations and Russian strategy over the next year, say 2025?
Thank you.
Well, you said you weren't a military expert. I'm certainly not.
Exactly.
Tanks.
I have a strategic question also.
Please add that as well.
Microphone is coming.
Thank you. Sorry. You mentioned that the West should have its own view on how victory in Ukraine would look. Could you outline that a bit more detailed?
So who did?
The West's idea of what a victory in Ukraine would look like if it's not the maximalist position.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So
I'll start with that as well.
you sort this out.
Sorry, me or you? I don't mind. I don't mind. Okay, sure.
Well, James mentioned, without defining them, maybe eight 8 or 9 out of 10 problems. I'm not sure if our lists would be the same, but I'd have roughly 10 as well. And the first of those is military victory, right? Which is a huge ask in the current circumstances, but is only one of your 8 or 9. Complete restoration of territory, not because that's something to bargain about or go into the details of history or historiography, but because the war started in Crimea and it has to finish in Crimea, because if Ukraine does not win those territories, then Putin's current strategy, where he openly talks about a cordon sanitaire, meaning Ukrainian territory west of the current front line, will be successful. Without taking territory back, that includes Crimea, Ukraine will be forced into this Kiev-Lviv corridor. Human population and economic activity will be forced out of the areas that are currently too close to the front line. That's already happening to a limited degree, and in Kharkiv in particular there's a problem. So all territory must be restored. Thirdly, there needs to be some kind of regime change in Russia, which we can't impose, but we know it has to happen. Because fourthly, military victory isn't enough without the dismantling of the Russian propaganda state that makes the war possible. If that still exists, if Russians are still being told all these strategic untruths about Ukraine and about the West using Ukraine as a puppet state against Russia, they will want to start the war again. Because if you believe this propaganda, you are under attack. So the dismantling of this propaganda state has to some degree occur. It's difficult because that's internal. Some degradation of Russia's overall military capacity has to be part of its strategic defeat. Otherwise, again, they'll be wanting to start the war again. Don't know how many that is now, but the one that we probably can't do, but as you're missing one of 10, is nuclear. Right? I would love to see Russia nuclear disarmed because it has proven that it does not obey the rules about the informal rules about how nuclear weapons are supposed to be used, right? And has dangerously destabilized the entire world, including in the direction of proliferation. Right? Plenty of countries that now think we need nuclear weapons to defend ourselves against these kind of threats. So we're probably not going to get that. So you're not going to get everything that you need for a secure. If I make a joke about eternal peace, all the Ukrainians in the room will know what I mean. This was signed with Poland in the 1660s. It didn't last very long. But we need some kind of eternal peace that does last. And we need way more than military victory, which is why the West is so behind where it should be.
I can't but agree. I think that, again, we find it difficult to define victory because we're afraid of not achieving those goals, as I was saying earlier. We shouldn't, but there you have it. But ultimately, you're not going to get, Europe will not be at peace, and Russia will not be at peace with itself until it no longer wants to do the things that it does, and until it's deeply problematic strategically, because I'm afraid it's fashionable to say this is not Russia's war, that it's the Kremlins and the leaderships and a few rabid nationalists, but that is sadly not true. And this is and my experiences in the region are such that when I've been in Belarus, say, which Andrew knows much better than I do, but from Belarus to Kazakhstan, then these other states, their younger generations do not have pretensions towards greatness. They just want to be a normal country, and they are considerably more liberal than their counterparts in Russia. When I have spoken to a Russian younger generation, again, not for a few years now, then they have been inculcated with nationalist inflections. And that is deeply worrying, because it means that even if Putin doesn't necessarily have a succession plan, then the next generation are not likely to be any more touchy-feely than the current one. And Putin, and as we see in Russia right now, then there is a beginnings of a process to hand down power to the sons, possibly daughters, but I think more like sons, of some of the people in power, the Patrushevs and etc. So I'm afraid I'm enough of a determinist not to think that Russia and democracy are incompatible, but to think that there's no end in sight in terms of changing the Russian mindset, and that's the big long-term strategic goal, to change Russians to make Russia a normal country, to change Russians into Russian younger generation, to be concerned about the things that younger people should all be concerned about, rather than the things that they are concerned about, which as I say is, and I have some sympathy. I do understand that the war is not popular in Russia. I do understand that, but in spite of that, it's largely not popular because people are afraid of sending their sons and husbands to the war, as opposed to thinking that Ukraine is a fully independent, sovereign country of equals, which I'm afraid the Russians simply do not think like that. And so yes, they're Stockholm syndrome prisoners in some respects, but I think they at some point, like the Germans after World War II, they will have to reckon with themselves with what they have done. And I don't see any sign of, and of course, there is zero sign of any contrition. And most Russians, I'm afraid, think we can dig into this a bit, but now that we're in it, we might as well win it. And that is also blameworthy and just as problematic as being very bitterly nationalist, because it doesn't help Ukraine. It doesn't help Ukraine that much. So my answer to your question is that of course there is a short-term victory which can be fairly easily defined in terms of regaining territory, and a medium-term victory in terms of reparations and judicial reckoning, if you like, and then there's a long-term victory in terms of changing Russia itself. So that's my three: short, medium, and long. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. We have questions over here. Let's start with Mogens.
My name is Mogens Pill from the University of Copenhagen, and I have a question regarding your mentioning that we should perhaps not be so fanatic, or at least adamant about unity in Europe.
Okay.
And you mentioned Slovakia, you mentioned Hungary, and also Turkey, perhaps. I'm interested in two things, as a question. First of all, how do you foresee perhaps the fault lines within Europe? The fault lines or the front lines, whatever we should call it. And I'm particularly interested in Germany, of course, in this case. Of course, this is Germany, this is Europe and Russia. To some extent, it involves China in this policy, but let's keep it to Russia.
For sure.
What kind of, where do you see Germany go? And I ask this question because there is, we're talking about Germany. There's political Germany, there's also a German economic Germany, if you like, or business Germany. And then there's a tradition, which once was mainstream, which is not so many years ago, represented, for example, by Horst Tilschig, advisor to Kohl, who's very much against the policy right now. Is that a single expression, or is it actually a kind of hidden mainstream right now, which will cause troubles or resistance in the future? Your take on that?
Yeah, thank you. I'll start for what it's worth, but so I'm not a Germany expert. I don't speak the language, but it is obviously a key question. And Germany, again, it's important to recognise how far Germany has come. There is something to the Zeitenwende, and I think actually, and obviously, it has given more than any other country except for the US. And I think that the Brits and the French are quite good talkers, but don't necessarily walk the talk. And the Germans perhaps don't come across as well as they might, but they have, from starting off saying they're just going to give helmets to where they've come now is a considerable change. But then it goes back to my point that we've done an unprecedented amount, but there's also a tremendous amount to do. It is certainly true that Nord Stream, for example, was thought of by the German leadership as a debt for what had been inflicted upon Germany, by Germany, on Russia during the war. And so that was very much in their thinking, that they owed Russia an historical debt, despite Russia starting out World War II on the side of the Nazis, and despite what was done in terms in Berlin,
and despite the map.
Yeah, all of that. Exactly. I mean, it is. But I mean, it's German liberal guilt taken as to reductio ad absurdum. So that is deeply problematic, and I think that, certainly my more hardline friends in Germany will say that Olaf Scholz is effectively a compromised politician. They will go that far. It is a confusing picture. Certainly, the Germans have been, along with the Americans, have been leading the way in terms of, obviously not with the Taurus missiles, but also, in terms of no NATO membership for Ukraine. They've been leading the way on that. It is difficult to. I think most the advisors around the Chancellor are particularly problematic, as I understand them to be. Again, with my limited knowledge of Germany, in terms of what they are still of the mindset that it's all caused by the West. It's all because of NATO enlargement. That the West is in large part to blame for what we have now, and that therefore has had an influencing effect on the leaderships. I do think that it's such a shame for Angela Merkel, one of Europe's, most intelligent politicians in recent memory, to have been so naive over so long in so many ways about Russia, and she's going to go down in history very badly for that. Which is a shame for somebody who's so intelligent. I think that I think that Germany is susceptible to evidence. It's not just it doesn't just do policy-based evidence making. It does seem to me that they do, when confronted with the horrors of Bucha, when confronted with absolute lies like Macron, they are capable of changing. They are capable of genuine policy change. But of course, the question is it does it come fast enough for Ukraine?
Mm-hmm. Great.
Okay, well, you might have guessed already that my first degree was in philosophy. So more of that. By promising a Zeitenwende at the start, I mean, what does that mean? To my reading, it sounds like zeitgeist. Right. So changing your way of thinking as much as your economic model or your trade model or whatever. And that hasn't changed. So by promising that high, clearly Germany is under-delivered in terms of mood change or thought change, despite spending a lot of money. And most of the Ostpolitik meme set is still there. Right? Dialogue, change through engagement. We don't, not so much change through trade, because obviously trade levels have collapsed, but in this broader sense of engagement and dialogue being the way to deal with an enemy, I think that kind of Ostpolitik mindset is still there. So in terms of the big question that James was given about learning, who has learnt? Well, Germany hasn't changed as much as Zeitenwende clearly promised. France has changed more. In fact, in a kind of very French activist way. You can see, in fact, Macron trying to act as a kind of catalyst, that he knows his way ahead of European public consensus opinion in terms of boots on the ground or weapons supply or whatever. So he's trying to be a catalyst out front. So in terms of who has learnt, Germany hasn't changed as much as Zeitenwende promised. France has changed quite a bit. But there's also this thing about what we've learned internally. So there is a logic, I think, of what you might call internal deterrence. So as James said, the West didn't react strongly enough to Russia's war against Georgia in 2008. We got more. So we certainly haven't deterred internal problems like Hungary strongly enough. So they've got worse. Same effect. To the extent that Hungary is now an exporter of a lot of its methodologies and problems.
To Georgia.
To Georgia, Christ, yes. I was thinking within the EU.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, so for starters within the EU, to Poland, less successfully, to Slovakia, pretty successfully, to Georgia, and in dialogue with the Republicans all the time. And related to that, in terms of internal EU affairs, learning is also about understanding and dealing with the consequences of your own actions, which we haven't done enough of. I.e., if you start on sanctions, then you do something about sanctions busting, right? Otherwise, you look stupid. And that means internally the states that are going around it, like Greece, and externally countries like Georgia who are enabling sanctions busting. So who has learned and what we have learned, I think both are problems internally.
Great, thank you. So we'll go to Tom in the first row, and then we'll go to Milos afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you. Tom Resett at Norwegian Defence University College. Thank you. My questions goes a bit on the European side and on the weapon support and lack of strategy on what the aim is for supporting Ukraine, and that has hampered weapon support. It's been reactive mostly. One point is that the Ramstein format will be replaced with a NATO or structure or led support. It's supposed to be more transparent. It will be more difficult for French, as you mentioned, to speak loudly and maybe give less, or as they say, they give a lot, but they don't say a lot about it, much about it. How do you assess that Trump-proof new setup, more transparent for supporting Ukraine? And since we have two fine British gentlemen here, what about the UK? What happened? You led, the support for Ukraine in the initial phase after the invasion. It's been more quiet, hasn't it? Domestic issues. What happened?
Okay.
Oh, it'll be that bad.
After you first, this time.
The UK. What happened? Well, the UK is embroiled in some serious fond de regime problems, and the regime will fall soon.
Regime. There was an article it was an awful article in my own institute's journal the other day calling it the Zelensky regime. What the hell?
Well, regime implies it has pejorative overtones about the legitimacy of the state.
Yeah.
I just meant fond de regime.
Yeah, I know.
Fond de
I was just kidding.
siècle, whatever you want to call it. Fond de something. Which has distracted a lot of attention. Except one of the primary architects of all of those problems, David Cameron, really pains me to say it, has been quite good as Foreign Secretary. In a kind of bizarre penance trying to
Yes.
rewrite what the history books might say about him.
Exactly.
So I think he's extremely pissed off for that job to be shortened by 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas previously it was the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary making the running in the assistance of Ukraine. More recently it's been the Prime Minister, but distracted, and the Foreign Secretary making the running. So institutionally that's different. So arms supply has continued, but because of the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary is making the running and doing the diplomacy, you don't get as much shouting about weapons delivery, but that is carrying on. The Labour, whom the polls say will be the next government, has said all the right things about it will be consensual, it will be bipartisan and will carry on with the same policy, even the same policy plus. Without a timetable, it talks about moving to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence, which is conceivable. There have been Labour governments who've been tough on defence. There was a certain Labour Foreign Secretary who founded NATO, Ernest Bevin, in the 1940s. But the strategic concept for the incoming government after the fall of the regime will be very difficult, because it will basically be elected to deal with a complex set of internal problems, right, which are really urgent. Some of which are related to external. Brexit hasn't been mentioned in the campaign at all, which is bizarre.
Well,
So-
on purpose.
Labour will set off doing the right thing, but find it difficult.
Yeah.
Particularly because the money is so tight. So I don't think the apparent fall off in British support is much more about, I think, visibility than delivery in the last, under Sunak's premiership. Though we did supply most of the easily supplyable stuff. So there is now a problem with having to resupply by upping domestic production of certain things. More I see problems going forward with a new government strongly committed to helping Ukraine, but with having so much else to do.
Yep, I fully agree. I mean, look, obviously, European industrial defence capacity, which I didn't mention but should have done, is one of the big immediate problems for this war. I mean, so we are our inability to do what we promised to do has led to the shell hunger, which has led to the loss of lives in Ukraine. It's as simple as that. And we are all collectively to blame. And there's been some innovations, with the Czechs finding some magical supplies of 155s, but at the end of the day, it has been not so much, not too late, but too little. But the ammo disparity is quite frightening. But although at the same time, it's also quite extraordinary. Because you do hear stories, and maybe the Ukrainians can give more stories. But the stories that I hear, for what it's worth, of having one shell a day to fire versus 300 from the other side is absolutely extraordinary. And of course, stories will be written about that someday. In terms of the first part of your question, there has not been a strategic sense of what to do with the weaponry that has been given. And of course, the limits placed upon. And maybe Andrew knows more than I do on this, but it does seem now that the Ukrainians can reach, anywhere on the Crimean Peninsula with ATACMS, for example, then it is slightly perplexing, I think, to many people why, for example, the Kerch Bridge is still standing. Obviously, it is defended, and the Russians know it because it would be so symbolic if it were to be taken out. But that is a possibility for down the line. The Taurus missiles, I think, would help more of that. They are better at it than the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, as I understand it. Or again, I'm no expert.
You're more expert than me.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. So yeah, I think it would be. It was depressing to see Celeste Wallander, the Deputy Under Secretary of State at Congress just 4 weeks ago, talking about how U.S. missiles should not be allowed to should not be fired into Russian territory, only to have that. I mean, I'm sure she wasn't very happy about having to say it, by the way, because I know her quite well. But and then just 2 weeks later to have that decision rescinded. It doesn't. Again, that is not strategic, which is kind of what you're saying. I think just very briefly on the UK. I won't go on about it too much because I don't think it's. I certainly think that we have. There are still. I would be more sympathetic towards the UK if I didn't know that there is still equipment left to give. I mean, this is, for Christ's sakes, ladies and gentlemen, this is the war we've all been. This is the war we've been preparing for. This is it, because it is our war. So I'm less sympathetic when I find out when you discover there are still stocks of ammo and kit which have not yet been given. I do know that the Brits, they want to have, we want to be able to place forces in different positions at different times, which is why there's a limited enhanced forward presence in Estonia, for example, compared. But it's. Again, we need to understand more. Trying to get to the strategic point of your question, and perhaps yours, that if Russia is more or less going all in on it, then we need a much greater all of society approach at every level, from the disinformation to the diplomatic to the economic. Going back to your sanctions busting point, to the military, and I'm afraid we're not there yet. We're still only half responding to each of those quartet of Russian threats: informational, military, diplomatic, and economic. So that's where we are. But I do think, for what it's worth, I mean, yes, this government will have a difficult time because it's quite weak as far as Gaza is concerned, and it's quite weak as far as Europe is concerned. But they have Lamy, the shadow defense secretary, shadow foreign secretary, may become foreign secretary. Or, if you want the rumour, by the way, which is only a rumour, I don't think it'll happen, but since you talked about Cameron, is that because of Cameron's success, relative success, hard as it is to say, then they'll do the same thing and bring on Blair as foreign secretary. But I know it's potentially almost as disturbing as Cameron. But he'd love it, of course. But I don't see it. I've heard it on the grapevine, but I suspect it'll be David Lammy. What was I going to say? Yeah, it's at least. I mean, look. Let's just try and say something different to Andrew. It is a radically changed Labour Party. The Corbynite extraordinary takeover of the Labour Party for a few years has now more or less gone, not completely, but more or less. That was so extreme as Corbyn was considerably more left-wing than a left-wing Danish politician. He really was. I mean, he said that the Russians should join in the investigation into the assassination attempt of Skripal. He did not understand it at all, and you can still see his writings in the what's it called, the Morning. What's a communist newspaper in England called? The Morning Star. Morning Star, yeah, it's classic. He's written in that many times in the past, and you can see his views. They're all to display. And it was an extraordinary capture of a Labour Party, but it has been taken back by, if you like, people who are more sensible in the Labour Party, which is ultimately, as we were saying last night over beers, and the left wing of the Tory Party and the right wing of the Labour Party are more or less of the same ilk, and that appears to be where we're going. As far as the Labour Party is concerned, and we'll see what happens with the Tories. But let's not get into UK politics too much. But at least, however, this is in contrast, of course, to the French. It's in contrast to the Germans. Italy is a slightly more complex case nowadays. So there is some cause for stability of continuity in foreign policy, which is not going to go badly adrift as a result of an election, which can't be said for elsewhere in the world.
Great, thank you.
Didn't really talk about Trump proofing.
Yeah, not
I love the word, but it's slightly mythical because it implies that you can do things in Congress, or certain walls can be put around the executive, all of which don't work constitutionally in America.
We have time for 2 quick questions and quick answers. Possibly. Let's go over here first to Milos, and then we'll go to the back. Thank you.
Oh, that's quite a challenge. Milos Kodas, the Danish Foreign Policy Society. It's been a while since we did something together when I still was working at the Polish Foreign Ministry. And I remember in 2013, I actually wrote, late 2013, I wrote an analysis, and that's actually a comment on James's remark on how diplomats strive for a compromise. And in this analysis I wrote, it's very likely that in the draft of it, that Russia will do something aggressive in its immediate neighborhood in the coming months. And my head of unit invited me to his office, and he told me, Miłosz, this is too much. You need to tone it down. And then Crimea happened. So I understand this idea that diplomats do want to find a compromise all the time. And I think it was a perfectly rational reaction on the side of my head of unit back then. And now in a completely different reality, we moved in our discussion a bit northwest. I suggest we move northeast now. I just published an analysis for the Danish Institute of International Studies on Kaliningrad Oblast. And I argue that this area, not only Kaliningrad Oblast, but also St. Petersburg and Leningrad Oblast, will become the main areas of confrontation between the West and Russia, not only because of geographical proximity, but also because of different points of content in the area, underwater infrastructure, all these things. I wanted to ask you how you see the next few years around the Baltic Sea, especially that the UK has always had very strong interest in the area. I'm not even thinking only about the bombing of Copenhagen in 1807, was it?
No, let's not go
Let's leave
there.
it all behind. Yes. So I would like to hear your take on that.
So Baltic Sea, Kaliningrad.
Sorry.
While you
Sorry.
think about this, let's do
Still
our final question, and then you can decide if you would like to say anything.
Kaliningrad.
How about the Baltic Sea and the challenges that we have, please?
So I'm Vitaly Fedorenko from Strategic Communication Institute of the National Defense University of Ukraine. So James, thank you for your presentation. And my question is for you both. So it is about what is your opinion? How it looks like top of the Russian narratives against?
I didn't catch it. Say again. How does it look? Russian
Looks Russian narratives.
narrative. Sorry.
Against democratic countries and against another countries who express a neutral vision about the situation, and how it is better to improve this to get advantages for Ukraine.
Great. Short question, but hard question.
Did you say neutral vision?
Yes, I mean that it is countries who don't support directly Ukraine.
Okay.
So we have a question about Kaliningrad, Baltic Sea. We have a question about Russian narratives
Thank you.
to undermine states that support Ukraine and even states that remain
Yeah.
neutral in this. And what would your recommendation be?
So, on those western oblasts and Kaliningrad, the exclave of Kaliningrad in particular, I think when you go down to Lithuania, then it is a serious concern that the Russians will, when under pressure elsewhere, look to save their asset, as they see it, undoubted asset actually, of Kaliningrad, and that they will try to clear a path and to ensuring there's a de facto land bridge to Kaliningrad, and that is absolutely, having been in Vilnius last week, uppermost in terms of their priorities. It's what they see as their number one security threat. It is. I can't tell you what a valuable asset it is to the Russians, and whilst they don't think of it in the same way as they think of Ukraine as being theirs, because for Ukraine it's a sort of a mythological a part of Russia, and Russia isn't Russia without Ukraine. Then for Kaliningrad it's more strategic, and I think I think far more so than Narva at the top, then that is the more likely area of vulnerability. But of course, other enhanced forward presence and joint expeditionary forces are looking to ensure that doesn't happen, and obviously the point about those is to give time for reinforcements to arrive should that happen. But I absolutely, in terms of the Baltic Sea, then Russians fear that they are being locked out of it and are trying things above and below the surface water. And again, in terms of I'm not an expert on maritime issues, but I mean it is clearly an area where we are, we're not winning everywhere, but we seem to be gaining the upper hand as far as that is concerned, despite Russian attempts on various islands near here and further north, of course, towards Svalbard. But so yeah, I don't really have a very good answer other than to say that that of course because Russia is going all in on Ukraine for fear of losing there, then it is obviously leaving vacuums elsewhere, and whether those vacuums are in Karabakh on the front, or whether they're in the Baltic Sea or in the Arctic, then then there is going to be opportunity for others to fill a vacuum, and we have to make sure that it's not China that fills that vacuum, but in fact it is the West, done as subtly and kindly as possible, of course. Just on countering Russian narratives, I mean it is hard. It is very hard to because the Russians have got a strong case to make for less scrupulous countries. They are, because we attach strings to the deals, because we have values, eroded as they are, then we won't deal with everybody. We're not going to deal with a nasty tin pot dictatorship like Eritrea and offer them sweeteners, but Russia's quite happy to. It'll offer them anything from regime security, private military help, money, weapons, etc., etc., none of which we're willing to give to Eritrea. We might do. It's not to say you can't. There aren't some deals to be done, but the Russians can offer more than we can. We have to appeal to a sense of morality, which doesn't go down necessarily that well. So I do think that we are not so much as fighting a losing battle, but it's an uphill struggle in terms of bringing on the waverers, those countries in the middle that you're talking about. The ones who are onside are onside, the ones who are offside are always going to be offside, but that large swathe in the middle is up for grabs, and the Russians are extremely good, and that is where they are. That is where they have concentrated their efforts in recent months, because they have seen that the narrative of the global majority is a winning narrative, as opposed to, Zelensky as a Nazi, which is not a winning narrative, and obviously everyone can see through that. So we have got to up our game whilst retaining our values in terms of capturing those fence sitters.
It is very important to look at the content of Russian narrative, which is always instrumental and strategic. Initially, I mean, we all remember these jokes about, in the post-Soviet space, how apartments, plumbing would be advertised as Европейский standard, okay?
Yeah.
Which is very attractive for ordinary Russians. They wanted la vie européenne. They wanted prosperity, comfortable life. So a huge part of Russian propaganda messaging has been undermining that. If you look at Europe, it's omnipresent on Russian news, and it's always the opposite. You're not safe. There's crime everywhere. There is immigration, and so on and so forth. So that la vie européenne doesn't exist. So that's a kind of reverse message back to Russian populations, but there is attempts to triangulate that. there were some really good studies by some of my colleagues at King's College London about how pro-Brexit forces and Russian propaganda were fishing in the same seas for the same stories about, how terrible Europe was and how awful migrants were, and they were often quoting each other. There has been some traction in that. Other arguments about sovereignty and about weak states being American puppets, I mean, they work if your state is, they have some traction if your state is really weak. But they are so tied up with Russian ideas about a sphere of influence and this kind of Carl Schmitt idea of limited sovereignty states, that you can't really use those arguments in Germany or France or anywhere like that. Russia has switched to this idea of a global party of war. You can see that kind of propaganda in Georgia at the moment, many other places, which connects with this third world idea where or we don't have a good collective term for what used to be called the third world, developing world, global south. The whole point is that it's not collective. But that does link to these anti-colonial narratives, particularly about American hegemony. What doesn't work, and that works quite well, given that a country on an obvious re-imperialising mission is able to talk in this kind of way, it's quite extraordinary. But what doesn't work is this idea of Russian leading a multipolar world so much, right? Because it's not seen as that strong. China maybe, but China comes with problems. So there is some traction, and Ukraine, I think, if we finally return to this theme of learning again, Ukraine has learnt a lot about how it presents its diplomatic case and who it presents it to, and it's made some really good efforts in presenting itself to the developing world and trying to counteract those Russian arguments by saying, look, this is a colonial war against us, right? And you know what colonial wars are like. And we'll see just how many turn up at the weekend at the summit.
Great, thank you for this. We have reached the end of this first panel, and I'd like to thank, of course, James Nixey from Chatham House, Andrew Wilson from University College London. Before I ask you to join me in thanking our speakers, just two things. Let me again express my appreciation for the cooperation that we had with the British Embassy. We very much thank you for your support. After this, I invite you into the front room where food is already ready for you. Drinks will be served. And then we will meet for those of you who want to join us, of course, we will meet in 30 minutes' time for the next panel, which will be on the wider security developments in and around Ukraine. But for now, please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for taking the time today. Thank you so much. Thank you.